This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast, a podcast about area poets and the poetry that matters to them. I am your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Melissa Studdard. Welcome, Melissa.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here chatting with you today.
It's nice to have you, and it is indeed an honor. Melissa is the author of 5 books, including the poetry collections Dear Selection Committee and I Ate the Cosmos for Breakfast, the poetry chapbook Like a Bird with 1,000 Wings, and the young adult novel 6 Weeks, Yehidah. Her work has been featured by NPR, PBS, the New York Times, The Guardian, Ms. Magazine, and Houston Matters, and has also appeared in a wide variety of periodicals such as Poetry, Kenyon Review, Psychology Today, New Ohio Review, Harvard Review, New England Review, and Poets and Writers. So it's an impressive resume of writing, Melissa, so it really is a great honor to have you with us today. Would you just tell our listeners more about you as a poet?
Sure. Thank you. And it's a great honor for me too, to be here as well. Let me see, what do I want to say about myself as a poet? I think stylistically, I really lean towards sort of surreal, metaphor-driven lyric poems that are sometimes serious, sometimes funny, oftentimes both. And I love to see like surprises and leaps in both my own work and work by others. So that's definitely something that I look for and strive for in my own work. And I'd say in terms of content, I really strive for a balance between sort of tangible human and environmental type concerns, sort of balanced with more abstract, transcendental spiritual topics.
Having read from Dear Selection Committee, that's all there. There's the your gripping use of detail. I mean, the close observations of what you're seeing and the honesty with which you express the experience of those things is very, very powerful.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I know when I read others' work, I am also really looking for that kind of honesty. Like sometimes I feel like there's more intimacy in a poem than in a lot of conversations, because I love how poets will just put it right out there, something that they may not actually say in a conversation about something that they've done or felt or that kind of thing. And it makes me feel a real sense of connection, and I strive to give that also to people who are reading my poems.
Oh, I agree. I think it's poetry is a real oasis to take a beautiful book and get off the grid with that and be in the company of a person who has put their soul on the page and some vision of that, some version and vision of who they are and what they're experiencing. It's, in an age of ghostwriting and content generation on social media, and you don't know if you're on Instagram, if you're looking at an ad anymore, or
it's true.
So getting back to the poet's page is a real relief. Would you tell us, how long have you been writing?
Oh gosh, that's such a funny question for me. I mean, it seems like it would be straightforward, but I would say I have really been writing in my head, like forever, like before I even knew it was writing. Like I can remember being a little kid, just riding around the neighborhood on my bicycle, narrating, my ride through the neighborhood in my head, or like blow drying my hair as a teenager and making up dialogue while I was blow drying my hair. And I didn't know what I was doing. Probably it's good that I became a writer, because, otherwise what would that have all meant? But so that was sort of the beginning, but I didn't, like I said, I didn't know at that point that I could be a writer or what that all meant. But over time, I started that process of getting it down on the page, which is an entirely different matter. And I started in graduate school. I went to graduate school for poetry, and that's when I really started writing But then it was kind of in fits and starts because after graduate school, I had a child and got divorced shortly afterwards. So there was a good 10-year period when I was a single parent of a young child. I had a really demanding job and I didn't write really at all for about 10 years. So I would say I was in my just almost 40 when I really started writing and didn't stop again, you know.
Oh, that's great. I'm just curious, who was your first audience when you decided to finally put the words on the page and time afforded itself to you?
Yeah, my first audience was my daughter. So thank you for asking that. I think what happened is my daughter actually loved to read so much. Even when she was in preschool and they would have show and tell and kids would bring in their Barbies and their trucks and all of that, my daughter would dictate a book to me and have me write it down. And then she would make photocopies and pass them out to the class and give the original to the teacher for show and tell. So what finally occurred to me was that instead of writing being a thing that had to take me away from her, it could be something that could bring us together. So my first book was actually a children's book that I wrote with the idea of, I mean, it's when I look back, I'm like, oh my God, that book was so didactic because it was teaching her life lessons that I wanted her to know. So yeah, that she was my first audience.
Oh, it sounds like she was your first little mentor too, right? She was, and your agent finding you an audience. That's pretty cool.
It's amazing how much we learn from our kids. I also learned from her how to speak in public, because even though I have been teaching for many, many years, I still got nervous about something like giving a poetry reading or, speaking in front of my colleagues. And my daughter was in speech when she was in junior high school, and I was driving her to a competition one time. And I said, how do you do this without getting nervous? And she said, oh God, Mom, I'm so nervous. I just do it anyway. And I thought, wow, it was like a revelation to me, and I thought I can do that too. Like, no matter how nervous I am, I can just go and give a poetry reading or, give a poetry talk or whatever. And I just started doing it. And, over time, that nervousness falls away just from familiarity.
That's amazing what our kids do teach us. And just on the subject of the audiences for your poetry, when you go to readings, how would you describe that experience for people who maybe haven't been to a reading or have poems that they've thought about taking to an open mic but haven't?
What I would say is that it's an incredibly positive experience and that audiences are incredibly supportive. So if you've got some, voice in your head, some critical voice in your head that's saying, oh, I can't do that, people will not receive my poems well or judge me or anything like that, to just try to silence that voice. Because I mean, I can't speak to every experience that's ever happened, but from every experience that I've had, whether it has been as a reader or as a listener at someone else's reading, the audience is just so supportive. They're coming there because they want to hear from you. They want to connect with your words. They're looking for meaning and to contextualize their own experiences. And, if you can just sort of remember that and keep in mind that, ultimately it's not about you, even though you may be the one on the stage. Ultimately, it's about that connection among everybody who's there, really.
What you're saying resonates with me because so many poets that I've spoken to, that is their experience. And I was speaking to Tom Nicotera, who's another Connecticut poet, yesterday, and he was describing exactly that. As a young man, he actually changed his major from science to English because that elective he had to take as an undergrad changed his life. And he went with it, and he wound up in DC going to American University to get his master's degree in literature, and putting on events for people to come together to read. And he's done that for his entire life. It is almost like just show up and be accepted. I think it's something for the world to think about, right? Not to be too grand about it, but in this world of artifice and pretense, there's a whole underground of people writing poetry and putting their words down and wanting that authentic human interaction with who they truly are.
It's so true. And like you said earlier, people can be really brave and raw and bold and really share the depths of who they are. And yeah, you're right. It's such a wonderful antidote to all the other things that are surface. And
we find out we're not alone, but sometimes we find out we're not alone when we find the poem that really opens up poetry to us. Is there a poem that's been meaningful to you in your life and as a poet that you could share with us?
Gosh, there are so many. And one that I want to share is called Self-Help for Fellow Refugees. It's by Young Lee, who I'm sure you know. And it's from his book, Behind My Eyes. But I want to say that for me, when I was really coming into wanting to write poems, I was reading a lot of Young Lee poems. So for me, it's not so much about a specific poem as it is about his work as a whole and what he was doing across many poems. But this is a really great example of his work. So I'll read it. Self-Help for Fellow Refugees. If your name suggests a country where bells might have been used for entertainment, or to announce the entrances and exits of the seasons or the birthdays of gods and demons, it's probably best to dress in plain clothes when you arrive in the United States and try not to talk too loud. If you happen to have watched armed men beat and drag your father out the front door of your house and into the back of an idling truck before your mother jerked you from the threshold and buried your face in her skirt folds, try not to judge your mother too harshly. Don't ask her what she thought she was doing, turning a child's eyes away from history and toward a place that all human aching starts. And if you meet someone in your adopted country and think you see in the other's face an open sky, some promise of a new beginning, it probably means you're standing too far. Or if you think you read in the other, as in a book whose first and last pages are missing, the story of your own birthplace, a country twice erased, once by fire, once by forgetfulness, it probably means you're standing too close. In any case, try not to let another carry the burden of your own nostalgia or hope. And if you're one of those whose left side of the face doesn't match the right, it might be a clue looking the other way was a habit your predecessors found useful for survival. Don't lament not being beautiful. Get used to seeing while not seeing. Get busy remembering while forgetting. Dying to live while not wanting to go on. Very likely your ancestors decorated their bells of every shape and size with elaborate calendars and diagrams of distant star systems, but with no maps for scattered descendants. And I bet you can't say what language your father spoke when he shouted to your mother from the back of the truck, "Let the boys see." Maybe it wasn't the language you used at home. Maybe it was a forbidden language. Or maybe there was too much screaming and weeping and the noise of guns in the streets. It doesn't matter. What matters is this: the kingdom of heaven is good, but heaven on earth is better. Thinking is good, but living is better. Alone in your favorite chair with a book you enjoy is fine, but spooning is even better.
Oh, that's great.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh, the way the bells and exotic, far away, and spooning, something familiar and immediate, and as you were saying before, visceral, and wow.
Yeah, he really has it all in his writing. I feel the wide lens, the small lens, the extreme individuality coupled with universality. The depth and the lightness. And I love how he goes through this really intense experience which he does at times in the second person, which also makes me feel like I'm living it with him.
Mhm.
And then by the time he gets to the end, he brings us to a light moment where it's sort of like he's saying that even with all the burdens of our experiences and difficulties and everything that we carry as humans, we can still find beauty and we can still operate from a place of love, even if we haven't been respected or treated the way we feel we should have. We can still have these moments of grace and still live with dignity, you know?
I think that the line "Let the boy see" is the one that, I mean, the whole everything you say about the poem, but let the boy see, and the tension between the mother and the father, and what they're trying to do for this child who's been thrust in a pretty rough world.
Absolutely. And I love also, you mentioned the tension between the mother and the father. And I really also love this line, try not to judge your mother too harshly, because I feel like although it's specific to this, it's also just great advice, you know, just in the world. I mean, I'm sure so many people would resonate with a line like that, or that it would resonate for them to think, yeah, that's right. I don't need to judge people too harshly, because what we see is that even though the mother and father are so at odds in this, they really both feel that deeply that they're doing the right thing.
It made me think as a mother, times I probably was pretty sure I was doing the right thing. Maybe not. These things need to stand the test of time.
Yeah. And maybe something can be a good thing without being the right thing, right?
Yeah. The life is nuanced.
So true. So true. And that's, you know, that's one of the things that I love about great poetry, is that it is also nuanced like that. It doesn't pretend necessarily to have answers that it doesn't have. Sometimes a poem may have answers, but sometimes it may just have the right questions.
Right. And that's another one of those comforting things about poetry, that it's okay to live with the question.
Right.
I'm an English teacher, and we have these time frames we work within to try to help kids acquire certain skills to be good citizens, and questions and answers, and to teach young people to live in that space between the two.
Mm-hmm.
And accept that you might be living there for a long time. I think that's what epic poetry teaches us anyway, is it's going to take you your lifetime before you can go home again, but to live the adventure anyway.
And isn't that strangely comforting?
As I get older and older, I take comfort in it. Yeah. Where in your sort of poetic journey did his work come to your attention?
As happens, I think, with a lot of poets, I was familiar with some of his work through anthologies that I read in school. And it's a wonderful thing, but it's also a difficult thing, because a lot of times what gets anthologized is not someone's best work, it's their most accessible work.
Right.
So the poems that I kept seeing of his over and over in anthologies when I was in school, I thought they were fine, but they didn't move me the way I was moved once I got into grad school and actually read a whole book. And then I said, wow, wow, what is this stuff? And so I would say grad school, is when, even though I knew of his work before, it was in grad school that I finally received it.
So did you find as a poet and a writer and a thinker that these other poets that you value kind of live in conversation with you when you're writing? Do you feel like that you're kind of in their company in a way?
Yes, and thank God, because it would be so lonely otherwise. You know, I mean, it can be lonely going really deep into your own mind and thoughts and heart. I don't know why, but it can feel that way sometimes. And feeling in the company of this conversation among other poets it's really a wonderful feeling. And I also like I mean, no matter what discipline, I'm sure, as a teacher and in scientists build on the learnings and findings of other scientists. And I feel that it's the same in the arts. We see some technique that one poet is using, and then we employ it in a different way in our own work. And then another poet sees that and does something different with it. And it builds. And the same thing with subject matter and content and all of it. It's kind of like, I think of poetry logic kind of like dream logic. Or at least for me, I'll have a dream where like my mom and my next door neighbor are the same person, and we're all in a place that I've never actually been with either one of them. And it's sort of like in your dream, your mind takes apart the different parts of your life and experiences and reassembles them in a way to provide you with some new meaning or insight or symbol. And in some ways, I feel poetry does the same thing, using not only our own experience as compost, but also the things that we've read, and particularly the poets that we love and have read over and over. Even when we don't realize we're doing it, a lot of times we're responding to their work.
That's so well said. It reminds me of an essay by Neil Gaiman in his collection, View from the Cheap Seats. And he talks about how we can't ignore the stories. Ignore them at your own peril. They will find you. But
he's great.
Because, and it's not just that we are who we are. We are the stories we've read and the stories we've been told. And he is. He does that. He doesn't let you get comfortable, or if not for too long anyway.
I love that we're also the stories that we've read. It's true. We absorb them and assimilate them into our the context of how we view the world and understand things. And that's a really powerful, important thing. And he's a great teacher too. I don't know if you've watched his master classes, but at that like masterclass website,
Right.
I highly recommend them. He's amazing.
He is. What can he do? And
Right.
You know what? It's funny. The poem you read actually made me think of a found poem that he wrote a couple years ago when pre-COVID and the Syrian refugee crisis broke, really, and Europe was throwing its hands up. And he wrote a poem, What It Means to Be Warm.
Oh, wow.
He got thousands of responses to the question on his Twitter feed, and he assembled a found poem about what it means to be warm. And again, great writer that he is, got to that transcendent place where we can find our common humanity and embrace it.
Beautiful.
So could we talk some more about your poetry, and could you just tell us more about the topics that you're most interested in? And I guess specifically, to narrow it down, Dear Selection Committee, the organizing mechanism behind this book. Could you just speak to this a little bit? It does all those things you talked about at the very beginning of our conversation. It's fun, it's irreverent, it's mystical, it asks great questions, doesn't necessarily answer them, and it stirs such empathy, whether it's for the falling leaves or for the struggling orca. So I think it's such a great book. If you could just maybe give us some more information about that.
Thank you. Yes, I'd be happy to. It was kind of funny the way this book came together, because I'm part of a writing group called The Grind. And basically for this group, you can choose what aspect of the group you want to be in on any given month. But the one that I normally do is poems, new and revised, which means that every day you have to submit either a new or, substantially revised poem to the group. And nobody comments or gives feedback or anything. You have to just put it out there and get familiar with nobody responding, no matter how great you think it is. And that's a really good exercise. But I was writing a lot of poems for The Grind, and I wasn't thinking about how they fit together or anything. And then I wrote the poem that is the title poem for this book, Dear Selection Committee. And as soon as I wrote that poem, I thought, oh, this is what I'm centering my next book around, because the idea of, well, basically, I'll just say that the structure is as if it's a job application. So the first part of it is the application part, and the second part is the interview. And then there are these little subsections of, flip through this and read a couple out. Or a few. So subsections like contact information or recommenders, education, informal training, honors and awards, that kind of thing. And it just occurred to me that if I organized a book according to those things, it would give me the opportunity to bring out these really human topics that we've been talking about, because by simply being placed under one of these headings, it gives new meaning to the poem. So like some of the poems that I had written that were, I didn't know they were funny until I put them into one of these sections, and then they were both funny and serious at the same time because of where they were placed in the book and how they were in conversation with the other poems. So it's kind of like that original poem, Dear Selection Committee, was like, like when you're organizing a room around a rug or something,
Right.
You want everything to match it. It was sort of like that. And so I started writing poems to fit the theme as well too. But I was thinking about, how vulnerable it is to be in the situation of applying for a job, because you're going to be accepted or rejected, and it's that you're putting out there, and your abilities and all of that. So that seemed to me also like an opportunity to really touch into a lot of what it means to be human. And also, I put this together a little like sort of surrounding the time of the pandemic and the quarantine. And I think that time had us all thinking a lot about the nature of work and what it means in our lives, and what it means to do meaningful work, what it means to have to earn a living. All of these thoughts were kind of in my head, because I know coming out of the quarantine, I wanted my work to be different than it had been going into it. And I think a lot of us felt this feeling of, okay, I'm spending more time with my family and having a more balanced life, and I don't want to lose that when I go back. So that was part of my thinking too.
Part of the pleasure of the book is looking at the outline of the table of contents, and the sort of the tension between that sort of structure that we all know, because every adult has applied for a job and been the person in that chair surrounded by the team, and there are the right answers in an interview, and then there are those things playing in your head
Exactly.
and you capture that with such candor, and it's just so insightful. It just the combination of humor and insight is just so profound. It's a really incredible collection.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I think that we all have that zany person inside of us who is not that appropriate person who is supposed to show up to the job interview. And there's a funny tension there. And I actually did have a moment in real life when I was interviewing for the job that I have now, where I blurted out one of those zany things in a job interview. And I was so worried, but obviously I ended up getting the job. But I mean, basically it was an interview with the vice president of the college, the dean, and the department chair. And we were sitting in a little room, and I walked in, and I had just moved there from New York, where I was like highly aware of my surroundings at all times and just had some kind of weird thoughts in my head. And there was a door, and then there was a big window and another big window, and there was only one wall where you could have your back to the wall. Right when I walked in the room, the vice president said, "Where would you like to sit?" And I said, "Well, actually, I'd like to sit where you're sitting." I can't believe I said that. And she said, "Well, could you tell me why?" And I said, "Well, yes, if a shooter comes in, I have my back to the wall. I can see out the windows and I can see the door." And she said, "Well, what would you do if a shooter came in?" And I said, "I would I would use your body as a shield or something just kooky like that. It was just the craziest thing. I couldn't believe I said it. And luckily she had the most fabulous sense of humor. She thought it was hilarious and she moved so that I could sit there and feel comfortable in the interview. So I think, in an ideal situation, we don't say those things, but having done it, I think that also fed into my wanting to play with that, in a book.
That's great. And your story is great because I'm listening and I'm thinking, so when we interview, are we interviewing on our ability to be appropriate?
Right. It feels like it sometimes.
And to get to the real human being is back to the beginning of our conversation. What is poetry about? And has the vice president seen your book?
No, she has not. I have not actually showed it to anyone at work because I just think they're going to think, who is this person we've hired? Oh my gosh. But you know what she did do after she hired me? She said, "You're fun. I want you on the planning committee for all the parties."
Oh my goodness. Melissa, would you read from your poetry just to let our listeners hear what your poetry sounds like?
Sure. I chose a poem which, after all my talk about being fun, is actually kind of more of a serious poem, but I wanted it to speak to and reflect on the Young Lee poem that I read. So it's called Migration Patterns. In the dream, I tell customs my llama is a goat, because sometimes the heart is not large enough to hold what is beautiful if the mind finds it exotic. Sometimes the mind mistakes itself for a hoarded piece of land, and little campfires spring up everywhere. Smoke slinks through chain link. Small hands and shoulders capsize beneath the dehydrated, salt-sick sun. In the dream, I carry mountains through international waters. I carry the hills, their babies, to safety. Sometimes I wave away a predator and there is fire in my hand, and my hand does not want to be part of a human body. It wants to belong to the llama, the goat, the hills, the mountain. In the dream, I've got the North Star in my trunk. I'm driving it across a border. I'm taking it to a different part of the sky. It can't stand what it has seen. What we need is not a fixed point. What we need is a world anthem that everyone knows the words to. One that says, come in, come on, come over, I've got you. In the dream, light leaks from thin cracks where the trunk door meets the body of the car. The star says, put me on the dashboard and I will guide you. The officer says, illegal. You can't take a star to another part of the sky. And I say, watch me. I say, I've got enough light to do anything.
Wow. That is absolutely beautiful.
Thank you.
And what you said earlier about sort of the dream world and the poetic world, they really take shape in that poem and offer hope in a world that's riven by borders and whatever borders mean to certain people.
Thank you. I had that dream that I was trying to get a llama through customs, and they were really concerned. For some reason, they were not concerned that I was trying to bring a large animal. They were only concerned that it was a llama, and a llama, yeah, and I did. I told them that it was a goat in my dream, and I wrote it down. I keep a dream journal because I think it helps you dream better when you keep a dream journal, because your unconscious and subconscious mind learn that you're listening, and they reward you by giving you more, I think. So I wrote that down and I kept reflecting on it, and it stayed with me, and I kept thinking about it. What does this mean? What is this about? And it was at that time when, the immigration was so at the forefront of the daily news and media. And I thought that this is what this is about. And then somebody contacted me. The Houston Holocaust Museum was having a reading about immigration and asked me to read, and I wrote that poem for that reading.
Wow, that's perfect. Well, thank you very much for sharing your time and your work with us today, Melissa. If our listeners want to read your poetry or learn more about you, where can they find you online?
Oh, yes, thank you. My website is melissastuddard.com. So that's spelled MELISSA, and then last name STUDDARD.com. And from there, I've got it pretty jam-packed, so they can find links to buying books or reading poems online, listening to readings. But my books are also available at the regular online places.
Yeah, you have a beautiful website that is so full and rich and navigable, though. It's a really well done website. So I think
you.
Who goes there is going to be very happy that they.
Well, thank you for the wonderful conversation and questions, and so many of the things that you said were just so beautifully stated, and I really appreciated being able to talk to you about all of this.
Well, thanks for being a part of People and Their Poems, Melissa. I'm very grateful.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.